Good morning, everyone, and welcome to today's Green Business Fund webinar, Energy Efficiency for Schools. So now I'd like to introduce our speaker today, who is Graham Hunter from the Carbon Trust.
Thanks, Susan, and good morning, everyone. As Susan said, welcome to this webinar today that we are delivering on energy efficiency for schools. Just to highlight, this webinar forms part of a series of webinars that we are delivering through the Green Business Fund scheme. All of which can be found on the Carbon Trust website. So these cover areas such as energy management, heating, ventilation, air conditioning, lighting, motors and drives, and renewable technologies, all of which we will very briefly cover this morning. But if people are looking for a bit more detail on any of these subject areas, then I would suggest just either having a listen back to those webinars or even accessing the Carbon Trust guides, which again are all included and available via the website for download. As Susan said, you should be able to see a box on your screen for any questions. We do have quite a lot to cover this morning, so I'll run through all the slides fairly quickly. But if you do have questions, feel free just to type those in as we go along. And then we will take a few minutes at the end just to review any questions that come through and come back and respond to those. So to briefly introduce myself, my name is Graham Hunter and I work within the business services team here at the Carbon Trust. I've worked for the Carbon Trust for just under 3 years now, and generally work as a member of the technical delivery team. So most of my work involves supporting clients to try and reduce energy use and their environmental footprint, either by delivering energy audits or providing procurement support, or even through carbon waste and water footprinting. So here's the agenda for this morning's webinar. First, we'll start with just a brief introduction to the Carbon Trust and the aims of the webinar. Then we'll give an overview of energy consumption in a typical school. Then we'll briefly cover energy management best practice before moving on to look at the most common opportunities to reduce energy consumption in school buildings. And finally, we'll have a run through of the key services that we can offer to schools through the Green Business Fund scheme. So for anyone who is maybe less familiar with the Carbon Trust, we are a not-for-profit organisation with a mission to accelerate the move to a sustainable low-carbon economy. We've been around since 2001, and these days are very much an international organisation. So we have a head office in London and then regional offices in Cardiff, Edinburgh and Belfast, as well as offices in China, Brazil, South Africa, Mexico and the US as well. And there are essentially 3 elements to the work that we do. So we tend to split things into either advice, footprinting or technology, and Green Business Fund would fall under the advice element of the work that we do, where we advise businesses, governments and the public sector on their opportunities in a low carbon world. And the aims of this webinar this morning are first of all to improve understanding of energy use in schools and the difference between high energy use systems and expensive to run systems, to develop understanding of how improved controls, management practices and new technology can deliver cost-effective energy savings, to also use some case study examples to illustrate the potential savings that could be achieved, and also to give an overview of the Green Business Fund services. So energy consumption in schools can vary depending on a number of different factors. So for example, the age of the buildings, the state of repair, the occupancy of those buildings, or even just the number and type of different equipment that is on site. Generally, secondary schools will have higher energy costs than primary schools because of the longer hours that they tend to have and the larger number of students. Secondary schools we find also tend to have maybe more widespread use of electrical equipment. And the charts that we've shown on the slide here are actually taken from the Carbon Trust Guide for Schools. So should mention that is available also via the Carbon Trust website. So these pie charts basically divide into energy use on the left-hand side and then energy cost on the right-hand side for a typical school. And these can be quite a useful start point just in doing a bit of a comparison and deciding which areas to prioritize as well. So to give an example of that, you'll notice on the pie chart on the left-hand side that lighting accounts for 8% of the total energy consumption. However, it actually accounts for 20% of the energy spend. So that's part of the reason why reducing lighting energy use is often one of the most cost-effective improvements a school can make. As I say, there are many examples within those charts there of areas that you might want to have a look at. So we'll come on to run through the key ones of those. So before we look at any particular technology areas, it's always good just to start with looking at some of the basics of energy management. So what we try to do on the slide here is just split those into 4 key action areas specific to schools. So the first one being to define responsibilities. So that could be just by setting up either an energy team or maybe an energy or environmental champion, making sure that staff and students are involved in the energy management within the schools, asking them to report any faults or issues that they notice, and also making sure that maintenance staff, who quite often have responsibility for a lot of the systems on site, are engaged and able to monitor and adjust control settings when necessary. It's also important to record and understand energy consumption, so making sure that meter readings are taken at least on a monthly basis, if not more regularly, depending on the size and complexity of the site. Also making sure that invoices that you receive from suppliers actually match the consumption that you are reading at site, identifying any issues there. And that can be done just by simply creating meter reading sheets and then doing a bit of analysis to plot the energy use over time. And very quickly you should be able to build up a simple picture of how the energy consumption across the site does vary over time. It's also important to develop and implement an energy policy. So to have something in writing that clearly states the commitments that the school is making in terms of reducing the energy consumption at the site. And also just setting out who is actually responsible for achieving those targets as well. And finally, it's also important just to make sure that regular housekeeping is undertaken as well. So again, that can be fairly simple. It could involve just walk rounds of the site by the maintenance team, or if you do have an energy manager, that could be one of their responsibilities. Making sure that any wasteful practices are eliminated, and also that any opportunities for achieving energy savings can be identified and then taken forward. So as I say, that's a very, very quick run through of energy management best practice. I would suggest if anyone wants to look at energy management in more detail, then we did run a Green Business Fund webinar on that topic that is available via the website. And there are also various guides specific to energy management that are available on the Green Business Fund part of the Carbon Trust website. Now though, what we'll do is just run through some of the areas where we commonly see significant opportunities to reduce the running costs within schools. So the first one of these is heating, which is usually, we find, that the largest and most expensive energy user within a school. So within the heating system, we have just highlighted a few key considerations here. So just to run through them, temperature settings first of all. So there are guidelines issued by the Department for Education and Skills on target classroom and circulation space temperatures for schools. So it's always worth just cross-checking the settings that you currently have against those to make sure that they are in line. Also make sure that areas of the school are heated only when needed. So you may find that your heating needs vary throughout the day, or quite a common one is, for example, in your gym halls, or even circulation areas within the school, that you don't have the same heating demand that you do within the classrooms. So it's just making sure that systems are set up to be able to manage that variance in demand. Checking thermostats regularly as well, so just making sure that any thermostats that are accessible aren't being turned up sort of by the occupants of the rooms. So one of the common misconceptions that we often come up against is that turning the thermostat up as high as it goes makes the room warmer quicker, when in actual fact the only real effect that has is just that it heats the room up at the same rate that it normally would. You just then end up with a bit of overheating at the end of that. Make sure that you keep all systems clear and unobstructed. So for example, radiators and vents, you don't have any equipment sitting in front of them. Also that any filters on external condensing units for air conditioning, for example, are kept clean of dust. And also make sure that boilers and pipework are well maintained. So as a minimum legal requirement, gas-fired boilers need to be serviced once a year. Oil boilers would be twice a year. And a regularly serviced boiler can be around about 10% cheaper to run than one that's not being maintained. Finally, it may be worth looking at upgrading any aging control systems that you have. So older controls tend to be a lot less efficient and provide less functionality, whereas with modern controls often there are a range of different options that you can have a look at. For example, you could implement weather compensation, which is a form of control that automatically regulates the classroom temperature based on the external temperature. at the same time, you may want to look at something like an optimum start controller, which is essentially an intelligent control system that will learn how quickly the building reaches your target temperatures, and then will program itself to bring the heating on at the optimum time before the building's occupied. So you're not having to set the heating, say for example, to come on at 6 a.m. in the morning to make sure that the classrooms are warm for 8 or 9 o'clock, when the heating could actually be coming on a lot later than that. So again, it's just improving the level of control to try and reduce the amount of energy that's actually being wasted. And just to give a couple of examples of those here, so these are a few schools that we looked at. The first one was where we looked at some fairly straightforward boiler control upgrades, and for an investment of £6,000, we were able to achieve a heating cost reduction of just over 20%. And the school there was looking at a return on that investment of under 4 years. A slightly different one was a primary school in Aberdeen, where we added an extra zone in the nursery extension, which meant that they could have different time and temperature controls in this separate part of the building where the occupancy was quite different. And they were looking at a saving of around £1,000 a year by implementing those improvements. Hot water is another area that we commonly would look at. And this is one where the school tends to be penalised twice, just given that you are often paying for both the actual water that you're using, but also the energy that's used to heat that water as well. So there are usually a number of fairly straightforward improvements that can be made to hot water systems without compromising safety or hygiene as well. So for example, fitting percussion taps, which turn off automatically and take away the risk of taps being left on. Addressing any dripping taps, so linking back to the walk rounds that we mentioned when we looked at energy management, just making sure that any issues like that are picked up as quickly as possible. Insulating any hot water storage tanks and distribution pipework as well will reduce the heat losses. Fitting and checking time switches to make sure that water is heated only where and when it is actually needed, and also providing cleaning staff with point of use water heaters can be quite a good idea if you say, for example, that the school is left unoccupied for a number of weeks during the school holidays. Then rather than having all of your large boilers running throughout the summer just to provide a small amount of hot water, you could actually have separate smaller systems there that would normally result in quite a significant energy saving. Building fabric is the next area that we would tend to look at, given that typically around 2/3 of heat from a school building will be lost via the building fabric. So the majority of that being via the walls and the floors and the ceiling. So it often makes sense to excuse me, to implement some improvements in this area as well. So, for example, again, going back to the energy management side of things, just making sure that regular housekeeping is undertaken. For example, you could start by compiling a checklist of areas where energy is lost through the building structure. and then make regular notes on the condition of things like window panes, window frames, or even things like roofs, skirtings, and the eaves around those as well. Then just make sure that if any issues are identified, that regular maintenance is undertaken to address those issues and minimise any heat losses. It's also important to check for damp, given that damp can cause significant damage to the building structure, and reduce the insulating properties of the insulating materials that you already have there. Similarly, make sure that you check and maintain the quality of insulation around things like hot water storage and distribution pipework. Improving glazing, specifically if you don't already have double glazing, then quite often that can result in a significant reduction in the heat that's being lost. Installing insulation during any refurbishment works can be quite a good opportunity to even reduce the heat losses at a fairly marginal cost. And then also, if you do have frequently used entrances and exits, then it can be worth looking at the option of installing draft lobbies around those as well, both to reduce the amount of heat that's being lost, but also actually just to improve the comfort levels of the occupants of the school as well. Again, just to give a couple of quick examples. So the first one we have here is a school in Wales where we did actually look at installing draft lobbies, and they were looking at a return on investment of under 4 years there. The second one was where we looked at a range of different insulation options. So the ones that we recommended were to install ceiling insulation and to insulate the empty cavity walls. This came at an investment of around the £10,000 mark, and we were looking at the school saving around £1,000 a year from implementing those two measures. So looking at a payback of less than 10 years, which once you consider the amount of work involved actually in insulating cavity walls was not too bad at all. The next area that we will look at is lighting. And lighting typically accounts for around 10% of the total energy used in schools. And there's often, as mentioned earlier, quite significant scope to reduce this even further. Normally with quite short paybacks on any investment required as well. So the first thing we would look at with lighting would just be to make sure that any lighting that's not required is switched off. Then we would look at things like avoiding a fairly similar scenario that we set out on the slide here, where we see classrooms and offices as well, actually, where blinds are quite often used to control the glare that's coming in from outside when it's relatively bright. The downside of that is that we usually see lighting being switched on because the blinds are actually down. So where possible, it's worth encouraging staff just to use blinds to direct that daylight into the room rather than actually blocking it out altogether, and making sure that any unnecessary lighting isn't used. Make sure that any failing lamps are replaced as well. So again, going back to the idea of encouraging staff and students just to report anything that they see in terms of any lamp failures, to make sure that the desired light output can be maintained. Labeling light switches is quite a straightforward measure, but also can result in quite significant savings. So again, another common thing that we see is where you have banks of light switches together. Occupants might not be sure what switch controls what lighting, so the tendency is just to make sure that they're all switched on. So installing, just labeling the switches will make sure that that doesn't happen. Then we would also tend to look at the option of installing low energy lighting. So typical savings that we're seeing now on LED lighting would usually be around the 60 to 70% mark, versus traditional fluorescent or halogen lighting. And at the same time as implementing LED lighting, we would also then use that as an opportunity to maybe upgrade the controls that you have in place. So things like if you have manually switched lighting, then does it make sense to have that automatically controlled, either based on the occupancy of the room or the amount of natural daylight that's coming in via the windows, or maybe even a combination of both of those things. And again, just a quick case study example of a school that we looked at in Telford. So they installed LED lighting with both occupancy and daylighting controls. And although the savings here were actually fairly low, so the existing equipment that they had wasn't the least efficient, but there was still a business case there to, even at a 30% saving, to install the LED lighting and controls. The next thing that we tend to look at in schools would be the energy used to power things like catering equipment. So again, just a quick checklist of things to look at here that could potentially save on the energy use and the running costs. First thing would be to make sure, if you are purchasing any new equipment, that you do factor in the running cost of that equipment when you are looking at the investment. So does, for example, spending a little bit more money up front on a higher spec model of, say, a fridge freezer, does that actually make sense if you look at the lifetime running cost of that product? Submetering can also be quite useful, particularly with things like school kitchens, which tend to be quite high consumers of energy. Often, if you just have mains or fiscal metering, then it's quite difficult just to look at your metering and work out how your electricity consumption is actually broken down across the site. So if there are particular areas that you want to submeter, for example, the kitchens or any food technology equipment that you are aware of is quite heavy on the consumption, then submetering would allow you to do that and to carry out a bit of analysis on, as I say, your breakdown of energy consumption across the site and pick out areas where you would want to focus your attention. Heat recovery on school kitchens is something else that's often worth having a look at, given that normally around 50% of the heat that's actually expelled from the kitchen can be recycled and used to offset things like the demand on water heating, for example. Ovens and hobs also use relatively large amounts of power in a school kitchen, particularly if you are looking at a large secondary school, where we normally see cookers being used for sort of 10 to 15 hours a week. So again, it's worth just looking at the use of things like the ovens and hobs, and making sure that they are being used in the most efficient way, and whether these could potentially be upgraded to more efficient models. Finally, refrigeration as well. So given that refrigeration will run for 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, these also tend to be quite high consumers of energy. So just make sure that these are being used in an efficient way, that they are positioned away from any heat sources such as the cookers, that seals are intact, and that just generally the equipment is well maintained, and that with walk-in fridges, for example, that doors aren't being left open when they don't need to be, that walk-in refrigeration is being defrosted regularly, and also if there is the opportunity within the school holidays for any refrigeration equipment to actually be emptied and switched off, that can also be quite a good opportunity to try and achieve some savings while the school is empty. So another case study here is where we had a school who looked at a range of different measures actually. So first of all, they did some monitoring like we mentioned with the sub-metering. That monitoring then encouraged them to upgrade quite a lot of the equipment within the kitchen. So they installed a dishwasher to replace a sterilizer. They adjusted the warm-up times on the kitchen and reduced things like use of hot cupboards, and the amount of time that windows were open as well. So the combined effect of those measures was that they were looking at a saving of around 30% on the energy use of the kitchen. They also achieved a reduction in water consumption there of 25% as well. At the same time as actually increasing the amount of meals that they produce by 33%. So quite a good example there of taking a fairly holistic approach at looking at all of the systems involved in the kitchen, and then looking at what the combined savings of a range of measures that could be achieved were. Also, electrical equipment such as any office and ICT equipment can also be quite a significant part of electricity consumption within schools. So it's worth making sure, again, just that any equipment that can be turned off is making sure that things like any monitors in offices, for example, are switched off overnight. And that's something that could even be automated by installing 7-day timer switches onto plugs. Also just making sure that equipment is matched to the task. So for example, things as simple as just double-sided printing can actually result in quite significant savings if you multiply out the cost of color printing over say the course of a year versus black and white on double-sided pages. You can achieve quite significant savings there, normally a bit higher than you would expect. Also, I think we mentioned with the refrigeration equipment, but this goes for the office equipment as well, just making sure that any heat emitting equipment like printers and photocopiers, for example, are kept away both from thermostats and also from the occupants of the offices, as particularly during the summer months, the heat gains that you get off this equipment does drive up the demand for air conditioning or office cooling. And also just finally make sure that you are purchasing for your requirements as well. So for example, don't overspec things like PCs with large screens and fast processors if actually what you need are just fairly simple and low consumption laptops. Another couple of things just to bear in mind with electrical equipment, again fairly specific to schools. So usually quite a good practical step is just to first of all make an inventory of all of the curriculum-based equipment that they have in the school, and quite often that can be enlightening as a start point, just to become aware of just how much electrical equipment is actually in the school and used on a regular basis. And then within that equipment, there will usually be a few things that are fairly energy intensive, just on their own. So fume cupboards, for example, would be one of those in science labs, for example. And so they tend to be something to look at on their own. Just for example, key things usually would be making sure that you have set the right sash height on the fume cupboard. So inappropriate sash heights will increase the energy use, as well as just be fairly ineffective in terms of the extraction of fumes. So make sure that's set appropriately. Not using fume cupboards as bench spaces, which is unfortunately something that we do observe sometimes, and also switching them off when they're empty or not in use, just to avoid them sort of becoming chemical stores. Another example of high consumption equipment would be kilns. So make sure that if you do have kilns on site, then they are fully loaded before firing them, and that they are kept clean as per manufacturer's instructions. Otherwise, you'll find that they will perform fairly inefficiently. Schools also tend to use quite a lot of audiovisual and musical equipment. So again, it's just worth making sure that any equipment that is not in regular use is kept switched off. Again, that could just be by setting automatic time switches. And also things like vending machines and water coolers, again, are things that only tend to be necessary while the school building is actually occupied. It's always worth looking at, can these things just be put on time switches so that they switch off at the end of the school day and come back on again in the morning, and also switch themselves off at weekends and in the school holidays, where you can again get quite good savings there. Any schools that have swimming pools, we do tend to find that they are one of the highest energy users on site. So particularly actually if you have a swimming pool that's being used by the local community as well. So again, just a quick checklist of things to look at there. So making sure that a pool cover is used overnight, make sure that backwashes are scheduled appropriately and not more than necessary. Make sure that pool temperatures are comfortable. that you're not overheating the pool water or the air around it. Might be worth looking at things like whether solar water heating can be used for swimming pools, or whether heat can be recovered from the ventilation air. And also it's usually worth submetering the consumption of swimming pools as well, just to gauge exactly how much of the total site consumption they are actually responsible for. Again, we do have a specific carbon trust guide for swimming pools, so if you are interested, if you have a swimming pool on site, then I would suggest having a look at that via the website. And again, just a quick case study example of a pool that we looked at where they didn't have any temperature or humidity sensors installed. So the exhaust air system was running more than it needed to be. So for an investment of £14,000 there, the swimming pool ended up saving around £7,000 a year. So a fairly quick return on investment there of 2 years. Final technology area just to have a quick look at is renewable energy. Again, for any more detailed guidance, I would have a look at the Carbon Trust guidance document. The most common renewable energy solutions that we tend to find either already installed at schools or we find ourselves recommending, though, would typically be solar power, so either solar thermal or solar hot water, or solar photovoltaic, where you're generating electricity that can be used on site or fed back into the grid. If you have space available, then wind turbines may, depending on the location of the school, be a viable option. And also things like either biomass heating or air and ground source heat pumps may be viable options. Again, these tend to be based on both the location of the school and also the fuels that you're using to heat the school just now. So for any schools, for example, that are running off fuel oil, for example, you tend to be paying a higher rate than you would be for mains gas. Then these technologies do suddenly start to make quite a lot of financial sense. As I say, that was a very quick run through of just the key opportunities that we tend to find, either when we visit schools or where we carry out remote support projects. What I'll do now to finish off is just run through the key services that we can offer to schools through the Green Business Fund. So first of all, Green Business Fund is a scheme that we operate, which is available to small and medium-sized businesses, schools, sole traders and charities in England, Scotland and Wales. There are some key criteria usually that need to be met by small to medium-sized enterprises to qualify for Green Business Fund, although as I say, this is also specifically available to any schools who apply to us. And so in terms of what's available, one of the key offerings is that we deliver a series of 2-hour workshops around the UK, and these are usually hosted by one of my colleagues who will come along and present on the usually what we look at would be the either zero or relatively low cost measures that could be implemented by small businesses or by schools. So we've listed these on the upcoming workshops on the slide here, but these are also there's an up-to-date list of these is kept on the Green Business Fund section of our website as well. And the two key services that I tend to be involved in would either be the energy assessments, so where we deliver either a remote or on-site assessment of both the energy consumption of a school as it stands, and also we look at recommendations to try and reduce that. So normally within the reports, we target three key energy saving recommendations, and for each of those, we would cost those up. We would provide annual cost savings figures as well, and then give you the sort of simple paybacks on those recommendations as well as setting out what the next steps would be in terms of actually taking those recommendations forward to reduce the energy consumption at the school. So as I say, that would either be delivered by myself or usually one of my colleagues on the technical delivery team. The other service that we offer is what we call our implementation advice service. So this is usually for schools where either you already had an energy assessment, or maybe you have done your own on-site assessments and you're already aware of your areas of high energy use. So there you would be assigned one of our consultants again, who would be able to support you in implementing an energy saving recommendation or measure. So say, for example, you had an LED lighting project that you wanted to take forward, then the consultant would support you to put together the tender documents for that project, to engage with suppliers and invite them to come to site to survey your existing equipment, and then to come back to us with proposals and quotations to upgrade that to a more energy efficient solution. The consultant would then review any proposals and quotations that come back and issue you with a straightforward report comparing the different proposals and quotations that you have. And as I say, that's a service that's also available to any schools within the qualifying geographies. In addition to those key services, we also offer a number of others. So we offer technical webinars, similar to the one that we've delivered this morning, but usually rather than sector, these tend to look at a specific technology area, and are usually around 45 to 50 minutes in length. Again, delivered either by myself or one of my colleagues. And on the same section of the Carbon Trust website, we also now have a range of Carbon Trust guidance documents that we've made available through the Green Business Fund. So we have a number of technology specific ones. So for example, on heating and ventilation, air conditioning, lighting, and then we have a few other ones on things like how to be a good supplier, one on carbon footprinting, and then one that specifically looks at renewable energy technologies as well. So again, these are all available via the Carbon Trust website using the link below. And finally, on the same page on the website, we've also added a couple of tools now to give SMEs and schools a sort of first step in a couple of different areas. So the first one of these tools is designed to help you to measure your carbon footprint by implementing some sort of fairly straightforward bits of data. The other one we have is a benchmarking tool, which allows you to benchmark yourself across sector, or in this case that might be against other schools. And finally, there's also a tool there if you specifically wanted to look at LED lighting, given that tends to be the technology area where we are seeing a lot of focus just now. Then there's a tool there that allows you to build the business case for LED lighting upgrades. Final thing to mention is that we also, on the Carbon Trust website, have a directory of suppliers and installers of energy saving or renewable technologies. And these are essentially a list of suppliers and installers who have been accredited by the Carbon Trust based on work that they have carried out previously. So if you are at the stage where maybe you have a project that you are ready to take forward, either let us know and we could take you through the implementation advice service, or if you would like to just maybe speak to some suppliers in your area, then one thing we would suggest would be to go on the directory via the Carbon Trust website and have a search based on location and technology area, and that will highlight some local accredited suppliers to you who you could get in touch with. So that brings us to the end of the presentation element of this morning's webinar. As we mentioned at the beginning, what we'll do now is just take a few moments to see if any questions have come through during the webinar. If we have some, then we'll come back and respond to those. But if you do need to leave us at this stage, then thank you very much for joining us this morning, and I hope the session's been useful.
Okay, so we've had a couple questions come through here. So the first question is, are there any typical KPIs for energy management, kilowatt hours, students, hours of occupation?
Thanks for that, Susan. Yes, there are. So there are a couple of different sources for benchmarking. One that we would typically use would be CIBSE, so that's the Chartered Institute of Building Services Engineers. So they provide to their members some benchmarking figures based on the type of building. These tend to be kilowatt hour consumption per square meter. So that, depending on the type of building, that might just be just a figure for each fuel type, or it may be more detailed than that, in that it would actually break down the consumption into the different systems that you have on site. So for example, gas-fired heating and hot water, and then air conditioning and ventilation, lighting, small power as well. So yes, there are some guidance figures that are available via CIBSE. There are also some UK government figures that are published, although they don't, off the top of my head, I don't think they are specific to schools. But again, they are just based on building type. Another resource would be the Carbon Trust Guide for schools, which again we'd be happy to share with anyone who has logged into the webinar this morning. If that's not already available via the Carbon Trust website, just let us know and we could send over a copy of that. Finally, the other thing to mention is just that if we did do an energy assessment through Green Business Fund and actually come to site, then that is something that we would sort of do as part of the energy auditing process. So we would provide you with some guidance in terms of benchmarks or where you are relative either to the benchmark figures that I mentioned or also other schools that we've carried out energy audits on. Usually what we try to do is benchmark against a school that we think is similar, just to, as I say, get as a bit of guidance there. So yes, various figures are available.
Okay, great. Next question is, how does the Carbon Trust manage temperature control and the need for air changes in any building?
Yeah, good question. Maybe a little bit of a specific question for this morning's webinar, but certainly is something that we do consider when we are carrying out energy audits and looking at any control improvements. Normally, what we are doing, sort of rather than looking at things like the air changes that are required within the building, I would say that's something that we would sort of look at once we had taken a recommendation to the point of the school actually implementing it, and then at that stage we would get our accredited suppliers to look at that in more detail. What we tend to be looking at when we're auditing is the existing controls that they have in place and whether they are actually fit for purpose. But yes, that is obviously a consideration when we are looking at control upgrades, making sure that there is no compromise in the level of ventilation that you have in the building. So you do usually need to take a fairly holistic approach when we are speccing any solutions there.
Okay, you mentioned energy saving by replacing a sterilizer in the kitchen with a dishwasher. What sort of level of savings did you find?
Off the top of my head, I don't know what the figure was, but we could certainly come back to that question over email. If that's probably the easiest way to do it. As I say, that's not a case study that I was involved in myself, but we will have some figures there. So I don't know, Susan, if we are able to go back to the person who asked that question over email.
Yeah, that's fine. So after the webinar, my colleague Annie will be sending everyone a copy of the slides and just any more information. So you can either reply to that email or you can email greenbusiness@carbontrust.com and then they can forward it on.
Perfect. Okay. I think that's us just about at time. But yeah, I mean, I'm very happy if anyone does have any follow-up questions. If you do want to send those over via email, then we'd be very happy to come back to you. But yeah, otherwise I will wrap things up there. So yeah, thank you everyone very much for your time this morning, and I hope the webinar was useful.